There is a very curious moment in the awakening journey when something begins to shift in the way you perceive reality. At first, this shift can be so subtle that you barely notice it. It is not a dramatic event. It is not a sudden revelation. It is not as if the entire world changes overnight. In fact, most people pass through this moment very quietly. Something inside you begins observing life differently. Perhaps you have already experienced this. Maybe it happened during a moment of silence, during a walk, during meditation. Suddenly, something inside you notices that there is a distance between you and your thoughts. For many years, it seemed as though your thoughts were you. Every idea appearing in the mind seemed to define who you were. Every emotion seemed to determine your identity. If a thought suggested something might go wrong, anxiety appeared. If a thought recalled a mistake from the past, guilt followed. If a thought imagined the future, hope or fear emerged. It was as if the mind was constantly narrating the story of your life and you were completely inside that story. But when awakening begins to unfold, something curious happens. You begin noticing that thoughts arise, but they also disappear. They appear and then dissolve, like clouds moving across the sky. For a long time it felt as though you were those clouds. Every thought seemed to define your identity, but slowly something begins to reveal itself. You begin realizing that perhaps you are not the clouds. Perhaps you are the sky, the space where thoughts appear, the space where they disappear. This realization may seem simple, but it is profoundly transformative, because for most of human life, nearly every decision is guided by identification with thoughts. Thoughts about who we are, what we should do, what others think of us, what might go wrong, what we need to control. But when you begin realizing that thoughts are simply movements within the mind, something begins to shift. The mind continues existing, thoughts still appear, emotions still arise, but now there is a small space, a subtle space of awareness between you and what happens in the mind. And within that space something new begins to emerge. Clarity, a quiet clarity, a broader perception of experience. You begin noticing something that previously went completely unnoticed. The mind does not stop. It continues creating stories, but you no longer need to believe every one of them. Some simply appear and disappear. And when this begins happening more often, something interesting happens to fear, because fear depends on one very specific condition to dominate human experience: identification. Fear requires you to believe the thoughts it creates. It requires you to believe imagined scenarios are real. But when awareness begins to awaken, that identification weakens. Fear may still appear, but it no longer feels as solid. It no longer feels inevitable. It begins to appear as another movement inside the mind. A wave rising and eventually dissolving. And when you observe this repeatedly, something very interesting begins to happen. You realize there is something within you that is not being affected. There is a silent presence, a presence that observes thoughts, observes emotions, observes sensations, but is not exactly any of them. This presence has always been there, throughout your entire life, during childhood, during adolescence, during every stage of your story. Thoughts changed, emotions changed, experiences changed, but something remained. Something was always present, observing it all. This silent presence is what many spiritual traditions call consciousness, but when it is experienced directly, it is no longer just a concept. It becomes a living experience. And when that experience deepens, something interesting begins to happen in how you live. You realize you do not need to react automatically to every thought. You do not need to fight every emotion. You begin realizing you do not need to control every detail of life. Something inside begins to relax. A subtle sense of trust begins to emerge. A feeling that perhaps life is more intelligent than the mind once believed. If thoughts are not truly who you are, if there is something within you that simply observes, then who or what are you really? That question marks the beginning of a very deep investigation. An investigation many people begin after awakening. And when that investigation begins, something interesting happens to the way reality is perceived. Small details begin attracting your attention. Subtle events begin appearing differently. And sometimes curious moments begin appearing in life. Coincidences that seem strangely precise. Unexpected encounters. Answers appearing exactly when they are needed. Many people start asking themselves, is this just coincidence, or is something deeper unfolding behind the experience of reality? That question opens the door to something even more fascinating, because when consciousness begins awakening, reality itself may begin appearing differently. And that is exactly what we are about to explore. When this perception begins appearing for the first time, it is not a dramatic shift. It is not a sudden moment of enlightenment. In fact, it often begins almost imperceptibly. A small pause between thoughts, a brief moment of silence inside the mind. An instant where you notice that something is observing the flow of thoughts without becoming completely involved with them. At first, it may seem like a small detail, something you may not even take very seriously, but the more this awareness appears, the more a silent question begins to arise. If I can observe my thoughts, who am I really? Because for most of life, almost all of us live believing that we are what we think. If a thought says something is dangerous, fear appears. If a thought predicts something may go wrong, anxiety follows. If a thought recalls a mistake, guilt arises. It is as if the mind holds absolute authority over how we experience life. But when consciousness begins to awaken, something starts breaking in that pattern. You begin to notice something that once seemed impossible. Thoughts arise, but they also disappear. Emotions appear, but they also pass. Sensations emerge and then fade away again. Everything is moving. Everything is changing. And as this observation deepens, something surprising begins to happen. You start realizing that what you truly are does not seem to change in the same way. There is a constant presence, something silent. Something that is present in every experience, yet not exactly the experience itself. Think about every stage of your life. Childhood, adolescence, early adulthood. All of those moments were completely different. Your thoughts were different. Your fears were different. Even your body was different. But something remained the same. Something was always observing the experience of life. This silent presence is something many spiritual traditions have attempted to describe. But regardless of the name, the experience is always similar. It is the recognition that there is something within you that is not trapped, and when this perception becomes clearer, something begins to happen to fear. Because fear depends on identification. Fear needs you to believe the thoughts it creates. But when you begin observing thoughts instead of becoming them, something shifts. Fear may still appear, but it no longer feels as solid. It begins to look more like a wave passing through the mind, something that arises, grows, and eventually dissolves. And when this happens repeatedly, a new sensation begins to appear, a sense of space. Space between you and the thought, space between you and the emotion, space between you and fear. And inside that space, something remarkable begins to emerge. Freedom, not an external freedom, but an internal one. The freedom to realize you do not need to believe every thought. The freedom to feel fear without letting it define who you are. And as that freedom grows, the ego begins to notice it is losing something, because the ego depends on identification. But when awareness begins observing, the ego's control starts weakening. And when that happens, something interesting appears. Life begins to feel less threatening. Situations that once triggered anxiety begin to feel lighter. Moments of uncertainty become less frightening. When you are present, the mind is no longer lost in the future. And when the mind is not lost in the future, fear loses the space where it usually grows. Fear almost always lives in imagination. But when you return to the present moment, something interesting happens. Most of those imagined scenarios disappear, and what remains is simply the moment that is unfolding now. Breath, sensations, sound, silence, life happening. And in that moment, fear often dissolves. Not because you fought against it, but because it no longer finds the ground where it once grew. But something even deeper is happening here. When the ego begins losing control, something new begins emerging. A different form of intelligence. An intelligence that does not come from analysis, not from fear. It is a silent intelligence, an intuitive perception, a clarity that appears when the mind becomes quiet. Many people describe this as a sense of knowing, not intellectual knowing, but direct knowing, a feeling that certain decisions simply feel right, that certain paths feel natural, that certain actions arise with ease. And when this intelligence begins appearing, something interesting happens. Life starts moving differently. Not because you are trying to control every step, but because something deeper begins guiding the movement. If the ego begins losing control, and if this silent intelligence begins appearing, then who is actually guiding life? That question takes us deeper into the awakening journey. And the answer begins revealing something many people never imagined. Because when the ego stops controlling something, far greater begins expressing itself through you. And this is where the journey begins to reveal something even deeper. There is a very specific moment in the awakening journey when something begins to become clear, not as an idea, not as a belief, but as a direct experience, a perception that does not arise from the mind, but from awareness itself. This moment rarely arrives with dramatic intensity. There are no fireworks, no cinematic realization. In fact, it usually appears in an incredibly quiet way, almost subtle, as if reality itself is revealing something, without making noise. And what begins to reveal itself in that moment is something profoundly simple, yet profoundly revolutionary. You begin to realize that much of human suffering does not come from life's circumstances. It comes from how the mind interprets those circumstances. For years, perhaps for most of life, the mind has constructed a continuous narrative about who you are, a personal story, an identity built from memories, from past experiences, from opinions other people had about you, from successes, from failures, from everything that has happened across time. Gradually, that narrative becomes what you believe to be your identity. But when awareness begins to awaken, something very interesting happens. You begin to see that this narrative is constantly changing. What you believed about yourself 10 years ago is likely very different from what you believe now. What once frightened you may no longer hold power. What once seemed essential may now feel irrelevant. And when you begin observing that movement, an inevitable question begins to arise. If everything I believed to be me keeps changing, what actually remains? That question opens a very deep doorway, because it directs attention towards something that has always been present, yet rarely noticed. Awareness itself, that which perceives, that which observes, that which is here before any thought appears, before any thought appears, before any emotion arises, before any personal story begins. This recognition begins subtly. Sometimes it appears in moments of silence, sometimes it appears while observing the breath, sometimes it arises during a moment when the mind simply stops. But when it happens, something shifts. You begin to realize that thoughts are simply movements within the mind. They appear, they disappear, just like clouds passing through the sky. For a long time, it seemed as though you were the clouds. Each thought appeared to define who you were. Each emotion seemed to determine your identity. But when awareness begins to awaken, you begin to see something different. You are not the clouds, you are the sky. The space where everything appears. The space where everything disappears. And when that perception begins to stabilize, something deeply transformative begins to occur. Fear begins losing its power, not because life becomes perfect, not because challenges disappear, but because fear loses its ability to completely control your experience. Think for a moment about how much of human life is driven by fear. Fear of failure, fear of not being enough, fear of losing something, fear of rejection, fear of losing control. Fear often directs decisions, shapes choices, creates behaviors. But when you begin seeing thoughts as thoughts, and emotions as emotions, something changes. Fear may still arise, but it no longer feels absolute. It no longer feels inevitable. It begins to appear as just another movement within awareness, a wave that rises, and then fades. And as that perception deepens, something very interesting begins to happen. You begin noticing that many decisions start emerging from a different place. Before, decisions came from the attempt to avoid fear, or from the need for approval, or from the attempt to control the future. But when awareness becomes more present, those motivations begin weakening, and in their place, something new begins appearing. Clarity, a quiet clarity, an intuitive perception, a sense of knowing. Without excessive thinking, this does not mean thought disappears. The mind continues to exist. It remains a powerful tool, but it is no longer the only source of direction. Something deeper begins participating in how you live. Many people describe this as a sense of alignment, as if life begins flowing with less resistance, as if certain decisions arise naturally, as if certain paths simply become clearer. And it is precisely at this point that something fascinating happens. Events start appearing different. Situations begin connecting in unexpected ways. Moments that once seemed random begin carrying strange meaning. Coincidences begin appearing, sometimes small, sometimes remarkably precise. You think about someone, and they contact you. You wonder about something, and an answer appears unexpectedly. You follow an intuition, and circumstances begin aligning. These moments are often called synchronicities, and when they begin appearing, many people become fascinated. Others become confused. Some even become skeptical, but something much more interesting is happening behind these events. Something that is not only related to external coincidence, it is related to how consciousness begins aligning with life itself. And when that alignment begins happening, reality may start feeling very different. But this raises an important question. Are synchronicities truly increasing? Or is your awareness beginning to notice something that was always present? That question opens the doorway to a much deeper understanding. Because what appears to be coincidence may reveal something fundamental about nature, and once you begin to notice it, reality may start revealing far more than you ever expected. There is a very quiet moment in the awakening journey when something begins to feel impossible to ignore. At first, synchronicities seem like curious coincidences, small, strange moments, situations that appear to happen at the exact right time. unexpected encounters, answers appearing precisely when they were needed. For a while, the mind tries to explain everything logically. Maybe it is just coincidence. Maybe it is simply pattern recognition. Maybe the brain is trying to find meaning in random events. And in some ways, the mind is not entirely wrong to question these things. Because awakening is not about blindly believing something. It is not about replacing one set of beliefs with another. In fact, it is the opposite. It is about observing reality with much deeper attention without rushing to conclusions, without rushing to label experiences, without rushing to decide what everything means. And as that attention deepens, something very interesting begins to happen. You begin to notice that synchronicities are not only external events, they are reflections of something changing within you. Before awakening, the mind is almost always lost in thought. Thoughts about the past, thoughts about the future, thoughts about worries, thoughts about expectations. And when the mind is constantly lost in those narratives, perception becomes fragmented. You experience only small pieces of reality, small fragments of the present moment. But when awareness begins to become more present, something shifts. Your attention becomes more open, more sensitive, more receptive. You begin noticing details that once went completely unseen. Subtle signals, small movements of life, unexpected alignments that once seemed invisible. And as this perception expands, the world begins to feel more alive, more connected, more meaningful. Not because something magical suddenly started happening, but because your awareness began perceiving layers of reality that were previously hidden. Imagine someone walking through a forest while completely distracted. They are looking at their phone, thinking about problems, replaying old conversations, planning things that have not even happened yet. All this time, the forest is there, sunlight through the leaves, the sound of the wind, birds singing, the texture of the ground, but almost none of it is truly noticed. Now imagine that same person puts the phone away and begins walking quietly, slowly, without distraction. The same forest is still there, but now everything feels different. The sounds become clearer, the colors feel richer, the details appear. Nothing changed in the forest. What changed was attention. Something very similar happens when consciousness begins to awaken. Reality has always been filled with subtle connections, but the mind was rarely quiet enough to notice them. And when this perception begins to appear, many people pass through a curious moment, a moment of fascination, as if they are beginning to discover a hidden language of life. But there is something important that must be understood at this stage. Synchronicities are not a spectacle designed to impress you. They are not signs that you have become special. They are not proof that you now control the universe. In truth, they are something much simpler, and at the same time much deeper. They are reflections of alignment, a sign that your consciousness is beginning to move in harmony with life itself. When the mind stops fighting every moment, when it stops trying to control everything, when it stops resisting the natural flow, something begins to open. Life begins to move differently, and within that flow, connections begin appearing, encounters begin unfolding, paths begin revealing themselves. Not because you are forcing the universe to respond, but because you are no longer blocking the natural movement. And perhaps this is one of the deepest changes that happens after awakening. You begin realizing you do not need to control everything. You do not need to predict every step. You do not need to fight every uncertainty. There is a greater intelligence moving within existence itself, a quiet intelligence, an intelligence that organizes life in ways the mind rarely understands. And when you begin trusting that flow, something changes within you. Anxiety decreases. The need for control softens. The constant pressure of the mind begins dissolving, and in its place, something rare begins to appear. Trust, not blind belief, but quiet trust. A trust that grows from directly experiencing that life continues unfolding, even when control is released. Perhaps you are experiencing this moment right now. Perhaps some of these experiences have begun appearing in your life. Perhaps you have started noticing subtle signs, unexpected coincidences, quiet answers emerging. If that is happening, it may not be something strange. It may simply be a sign that your awareness is becoming more present, more open, more aligned with reality itself. And when that happens, life begins revealing something fascinating. It was never just a random sequence of events. It has always been a living field of experience, constantly responding to how consciousness participates. But something even deeper is waiting to be discovered. Because when you begin noticing these synchronicities, when you begin sensing this silent intelligence moving through life, a new question inevitably appears. If consciousness can perceive these connections, if it can notice these signals, then what else might be happening behind the experience of reality? That question opens the door to the next stage of the journey. a stage where the relationship between consciousness and reality begins revealing more. And that is exactly what we will continue exploring in the next video of this series. Gratitude for being here. Much light on your path. Quantum silence.